Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins sitting in for Mike Papantonio this week. Coming up on today's show, corporate money is flowing unrestricted into our judicial elections, and we'll find out what effect this is having on our civil justice system. The NSA hasn't been operating in a vacuum when it comes to gathering your data, and we'll be discussing the abuse of power taking place among private surveillance corporations. And in a positive step for our education system, school boards across the country are opening up to the idea of teaching children about man-made climate change. We'll have all that and more coming up, but right now, you've just entered the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
It's been more than 3 years since the disastrous Citizens United ruling was handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court, and the effects that unrestricted corporate money have had on our elected politicians has been terrible for our democracy. But the branch of government that often gets overlooked when it comes to following the corporate money trail is the judiciary, and the effects of corporate money are just as apparent in the judiciary as they are in the other branches of our government. And I have attorney Mike Burg with me now to talk about that. Mike, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It's a very important issue.
It is, and you know, as I just said, I think a lot of people often overlook the judiciary when it comes to thinking about government in general. You know, we always focus on Congress or the Senate or the President, but we forget that we have this third branch of government as just as powerful as the other two, and they're not paying attention to any of the money that's flowing into these judicial elections. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And the problem is bigger than people really know. As you know, the judiciary should be independent. In about half the states, justices of the Supreme Court as well as judges are elected. And they have to go out and raise large sums of money. Joanna Shepard, professor at Emory University, did a study on this. And really the results are predictable but amazing. One of the things she found was that it's cross-party lines. People may think that it's just Republicans, not Republicans and Democrats, but in fact, her study showed that it is more likely the money that business and corporations give to Democratic candidates and justices affects them even more than those pro-business Republican justices in terms of buying their votes. In essence, justice and justices are being bought.
Exactly. And you brought up a great point from the Shepard study, is that Republicans are typically going to vote or rule in favor of corporations majority of the time. I mean, the studies show that. But it's the Democrats, you know, the people we want to think are going to be impartial, that are going to protect consumers, they are more easily swayed by this corporate money than anyone else. And again, Citizens United has exacerbated this problem tremendously. And it actually, I believe it began back in the good old days when they started pushing tort reform, because the trial lawyers associations across the country said, you know, we can't have this. So they started putting money behind justices across the country in elections. But once corporations saw that, they said, well, we can outdo you. And they did. They are now putting in millions upon millions of dollars to purchase these justices so that the trial lawyers, the people out there defending consumers, protecting consumers, don't have a chance in court. Is that correct?
It really is. And one of the things I like to say is this is not necessarily, I like to spin it, which is this is not necessarily just pro-business. It is anti-consumer, anti-the public, anti-the poor person on the street. That what's going on is it's being bought and paid for. One of the interesting things about Citizen United is that since that went into effect, we've seen tremendous change in the kind of results we're seeing from Supreme Courts. As we already know, those justices that made the decision in Citizen United, when the study was done as to those that were most pro-business in the history of the Supreme Court, 5 of the justices presently sitting on the Supreme Court are within the top 10 in terms of being slanted and biased toward the large corporations.
Exactly. And I believe that same study said that we have the most pro-business, anti-consumer U.S. Supreme Court than we've had in the last 75 years. You know, since World War II, we're dealing with a Supreme Court that, a majority of the time is going to go in favor of big business. And there are numerous studies out there that confirm this. This is not a speculation or hyperbole. We know this. There is hard evidence. Just go back and look at the rulings, and it's there. Majority of the time, the business is going to win. And so, I kind of want to get back into this issue of the money in the lower courts. A couple years ago, I did a piece for the Trial Lawyer magazine, a big expose on the money flowing into judicial elections. And this was actually before Citizens United took place. And so for the 10-year period between 2000 and 2010, right before the ruling went into effect, the business groups, the largest of which the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, put $200 million into judicial elections all across the country. And you have to ask yourself, why do these people want certain judges elected? Well, the answer is obvious, isn't it?
Yeah, they want those people elected because they're nothing more than doing the handiwork of the corporations, denying access to the courts through making people go to arbitration, denying access to the courts in terms of throwing out cases that are legitimate. I must tell you, what's interesting today is that we as lawyers, which we used to rely on, the rule of law. Well, the rule of law, unfortunately, because of all the money in the judiciary, has changed. Now the question is, who is our judge and who are the justices who are going to decide it? Because they've made up their mind that regardless of what really the rule of law is, they're going to find in favor of the giant corporations. It's very sad and scary.
And it's not only the buying of judges, it's the whole buying of justice, because they're also putting money into these efforts to push tort reform, which is an absolute disaster for consumers. We've done the math. If you have a healthy person in their mid-20s who goes into the doctor and they amputate the wrong leg, and suppose it's in Texas where you have medical malpractice caps where tort reform is going into place. If they lived their entire rest of their life missing one leg because of a doctor error, what would the $250,000 cap would amount to? I think it's about between $4 and $5 per day for the rest of their life. That's a cup of coffee every day because the doctor cut off your wrong leg because of these corporate pushes for things like tort reform. And now, even more than tort reform, they're pushing this mandatory arbitration. What is that? What does that mean for consumers?
Well, I'll tell you, first let me tell you, your point you made about the med-mal is really a good one, Farron, because what people don't understand, I don't care, you're Democrat, Republican, that person who they cut off the wrong leg, they end up on the tax rolls. We, the taxpayers, pay for them, except for the person or the corporation that damaged that person, who should be held responsible and accountable. With regard to arbitration, what happens there, you don't get to have a jury of your peers, your neighbors, which is one of the fundamental rights in this country. They get to appoint an arbitrator, many times which is on a panel which has already been selected, so it's pro-business. You then have to go to that arbitrator. The cost is enormous. You have to pay that arbitrator, and that arbitrator, based on the recent Supreme Court ruling, has the final say with very little chance of appeal. So really, you really have what could be a rigged system by forcing someone to go to arbitration. And that's where we're headed. That's where we're going down that road. That's what the Supreme Court has said, and that's what big business wants. They want a rigged system.
Right, and a lot of these big businesses, cell phone companies I know are terrible with this. People sign these contracts, constantly that they don't read. And, you can't blame them. Sometimes it's 30, 40 pages, and the average consumer out there walking in to buy a new cell phone plan doesn't necessarily have time to do that. But what they don't realize is when they're signing at the end of that contract, they are agreeing to this mandatory binding arbitration deal. It happens, if you go buy a car, you buy a cell phone, any kind of large appliances. If you have a problem,
banks right now are putting arbitration clauses. And what people have to understand, let's use a phone company. Let's assume they're rounding up and they're stealing $1 or 50 cents from 100 million people who have contracts with them. So they're taking $100 million from those people. You know what the Supreme Court has told the public? You know what? You can go to arbitration and get your 50 cents. You can no longer be part of a class action, and you can't sue as a group. You must go to arbitration. Well, no lawyer and no consumer is going to do that. In essence, they've given these companies a license to steal.
Right. And in the situations, when you have justices that can't be bought and paid for because they're not elected, the corporations are out there and the super PACs, the Koch brothers, Karl Rove, they're still doing this. It's just we don't know what's happening because they're putting money into groups. There's a great new book out by Michael Avery and Danielle McLaughlin called The Federalist Society, how conservatives took the law back from liberals. And it explains how this conservative group called the Federalist Society, it's been around for decades, they actually meet with governors, they meet with newly elected presidents or presidential candidates, and they sit down and they basically tell them who they can pick as judges, who should be good for this court, who's good for this court, who's good for the Supreme Court, and they lay this out for them, and it's all based on who's going to be pro-business, who's going to be anti-consumer, who's going to protect the people like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce who are paying our money. And we've seen it clearly with the current U.S. Supreme Court. In the last session, I believe that 100% of the U.S. Chamber cases that came before the court were ruled in favor of the U.S. Chamber. And in this session, 6 out of 7 went in favor of the Chamber.
Yeah, it's really a sad commentary on our democracy, and the public has to be aware of it. And if they're not, and that's what's great about a show like this, to make them aware so they can really stand up and say to their congressmen, their elected officials, and saying, look, we shouldn't have elected judges, we shouldn't have elected justices, and we need to fight and stand up and fight this. As you know, in a simple state election of a justice, the chamber and the big corporate entities they put up as much as 10 or 12 or $20 million to get that justice elected. That's really a destruction of the basis of our society and our democracy.
Exactly, and as the Shepard study that we discussed earlier pointed out, a 1% donation, meaning if a corporation gives a judge 1% of the total money that they raise, they're getting a 46.5% probability of receiving a favorable ruling if they ever go up against that judge. And that is what our democracy has become today. Mike Burg, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for following this topic for us.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Mike Burg is the past president of the National Trial Lawyers Association. And when we come back, investigative journalist Brad Friedman is going to join us to talk about the abuse of privilege taking place with private companies that the U.S. government has contracted. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Barron Cousins, and for Mike Papantonio this week. If you think that the NSA and the big bad government are the only villains in the recent stories about spying on American citizens, then you haven't been paying attention. Your data is being mined by private companies who often abuse their power. And I'm joined now by investigative journalist Brad Friedman to tell us what's actually happening. Brad, the NSA story, a lot of people think that it's just the government doing this in a vacuum. But as we found out recently, as much as 70% of the work for mining this data is actually going out towards private companies. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. We have privatized this massive surveillance state in this country. I was interviewing Dan Ellsberg just the other day. He was talking about this, that, these private companies are really unaccountable. A lot of people think, oh, it's the government. I trust Barack Obama. I trust Congress. I don't know why they trust any of these people. I trust the secret FISA courts. But in fact, what they don't seem to understand is that these are companies, private companies, who are developing these tools for use in the so-called war on terror. And these companies developing these tools with taxpayer money end up owning this software, these processes, these tricks, these tools, and yes, they can then be sold to the highest bidder, the highest corporate bidder, to use against private citizens. And that, as you know, is something I can attest to firsthand, unfortunately.
Right. And so, well, they're getting the government contracts. The government is paying them money to develop these programs. So these were not something that they would otherwise have had the resources to build, the infrastructure internally. And the government is paying them to use this. And so once the government's done with them, they still have this infrastructure. They still have the ability to do this, correct?
Not only is the government paying for them to create these tools, but many of these companies exist purely because of the government money. If you look at Booz Allen Hamilton, where the NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden was said to have worked and was said to have made about $200,000 a year, those companies exist almost solely on government money. Yeah. And then they own the tools and the processes that they create on the taxpayer dime.
Well, and I think a big part of the story, the people who say, I have nothing to hide, they can listen to my phone calls, they can look through my data. But as you pointed out, you've been the victim of one of these targets. Several years ago, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce decided that they wanted to go after the people they perceived as their enemies. Glenn Greenwald, Lee Fong at Think Progress, and all of Think Progress. Explain what happened, because that's a story I think that everybody needs to understand. These are the same companies that the NSA is working with, and they've already abused their power, and we've seen it. So tell us what happened with that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, Glenn Greenwald of late has taken to saying to those who say, oh, I have nothing to worry about, I'm not doing anything wrong. He's taken to saying, well, great, then. Can you give me the email, the password to your email? If you're not worried about it, then why do we even have email passwords for those people who have nothing to worry about? So there is reason to worry, and you're right. That was underscored exactly about 2 years ago, when a scheme, a plot, if you will, that was put together by 3 defense contractors who were working with the government on this supposed war on terror to track terrorists around the world. 3 different technology companies, Palantir, Barrico, and HB Gary, had put together a plot on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to cyber hack, to cyber spy against people like me. Not just people like me. And we found documents that were exposed when Anonymous hacked into these companies, found documents that actually have my picture on them, a presentation showing how I was to be targeted, my family's addresses, birth dates, all sorts of private information that these 3 companies had put together for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for an attack. And the same thing was done to Glenn Greenwald by these same 3 companies on behalf of Bank of America. So, when people think, oh, there's nothing to worry about here, we trust this government, it's not the government you're trusting. It's private corporations. Now, do you trust them, and do you trust them when there's huge lobbying organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, like the Bank of America, who are willing to spend any amount of money to hurt at and get at their enemies? This is real. This is not a conspiracy theory. This actually happened.
And I remember reading your writing. Actually, went back through it and read it again this morning. They referred to your family, I believe, was it your sister and your niece, as pressure points, quote unquote pressure points to get at you. I mean, this is something you see out of a Bourne movie, but it actually happened, and they wanted to get you. They were developing. I don't know if they took it as far as actually implementing this, but the malware programs to infect the computers of people like you and Think Progress and these unions like the SEIU. They were creating essentially these viruses that would then feed them all this information. Now, from what I've seen, that was just discussed. We don't know if it actually happened, but it was a plan. They had the plan in place to do this.
Well, yeah, I mean, in fact, we have no reason to believe they would have not implemented that plan had it not been outed, had it not been discovered, frankly, thanks to Anonymous and finding these documents at HB Gary and putting them out there on the web for everybody to see. They released those documents. They stole and released those documents just days before a meeting between the parties, between those three Defense Department contractors and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce law firm, Hunton and Williams, a huge, very powerful D.C. law firm. There is no reason to believe they weren't going to finish the plan, meet, and move forward with it had it not been stopped by Anonymous and made public. And it also brings up another point. This data that is being gathered by the government, or should I say by the government contractors, the privatized government contractors, what's to say that information stays safe? You may trust the government with it. I don't know why you would, but you might. But who's to say the government is going to hang on to it when you've got, the FBI, CIA, NSA collecting all of this material in one place? How hard is it for somebody like Anonymous or China or take your pick to get at that information, which is all in one place, release it, use it, abuse it in other ways? This should be something that people are very, very concerned about. Well, unfortunately, there's so much politics mixed up into this. They have trouble understanding what's really going on and what the real concerns are about these secret programs that we can't oversee, that the Congress can't even oversee.
Right. And, the media wants to vilify Edward Snowden, call him a traitor, say he's committed treason. Boehner has gone and said that just within the past week or two. But you just pointed out a very important part of the story that I have not heard anywhere. Snowden, obviously working for Booz Allen Hamilton, had knowledge of the program. Now, he chose to leak the story that the program was happening. He could have just as easily leaked private information. He could have stolen information. Any of these employees working there could have stolen this data, sold it to God knows who. We already know that they have these essentially these black market places where they sell credit card numbers, they sell private data. This happens, and so Edward Snowden, to say that this man is a villain, no, he could have been a villain. He had access to all of this, and he chose instead to let us know what the government and these private corporations were actually doing.
Well, that's right. I mean, and it was actually something that he sort of alluded to in that short video interview with him. And I have heard others, people I've talked to have said it as well. This guy, there's a huge market for selling this material to the bad guys. If you really wanted to aid and abet the enemy, which is something that they're charging Bradley Manning with, for example, with the Espionage Act, which, requires evidence that you were trying to help the enemy. If Edward Snowden really wanted to do that, there would have been no problem doing that, no lack of buyers for that information. He didn't choose to do that. Instead, he chose to come public with it and essentially ruin his life, his pretty comfortable life from all accounts, in the bargain. So, there's nonsense that, he's some sort of villain. Really doesn't have a basis in substance.
Right. And, we knew that this was happening under the Bush administration, as far back as, 2002, 2003. And still, when we had this big uproar from the progressive community at that time, that's been relatively silent during this one. I mean, obviously, we do have a lot of voices out there saying this is bad, this is wrong, doesn't matter who does it. But you do have some that have now said, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not all that bad. Let's hear him out. It doesn't matter who it is, Democrat, Republican, Libertarian, Green Party. If you are spying on American citizens and just saying the Fourth Amendment doesn't matter, we don't care about it, we don't need it, forget that it exists, then it's a problem. It doesn't matter what party you are.
There's a couple of strange things sort of at play here. You've got a lot of these defenders of what Obama is doing saying, well, look, there's nothing new here. We knew about this all along. Well, we didn't. For one, we didn't have confirmation that Obama was carrying out these very same programs, that these were massive requests to get records from millions of Americans, U.S. citizens. That was not fully clear. But this notion that it's okay because we knew about it, you know, we knew that it was crappy and we knew that it was terrible under Bush. So the fact that it's still going on somehow makes it okay. The fact that it was illegal activity when it was done under Bush and made legal instead of, you know, anybody being held accountable, they just simply made these illegalities legal. That's supposed to make it better. We still don't know if it is being carried out as per the law. We still don't know if it's actually constitutional. And, you know, when you've got Democratic senators like Wyden and Udall yelling and screaming for years about this and nothing getting done, no additional transparency coming out, when you've got, you know, senators on the U.S. Intelligence Committee asking for it, you know, you've got to ask, well, what does it take? It apparently takes a whistleblower like Edward Snowden to thrust this into the national conversation. And whether he's a hero or a villain, I don't really care. But I do thank him for putting that material out there. And, you know, those people who are critical of him in one breath and in the other breath say, yeah, but, you know, this is an important conversation to have. How the hell did they think we were going to have this conversation in the first place, if not for an Edward Snowden? It's remarkable the way these people are thinking right now.
Very scary. Brad, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Always great to be here, Farron. Thank you.
All right, Brad Friedman is the founder and editor of bradblog.com. And when we come back, we'll find out how the pharmaceutical industry is cashing in on healthcare reform and sticking taxpayers with the bill. We'll be right back, so stay with us right here on Ring of Fire. Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. Even though only parts of the Affordable Care Act have taken effect so far, Big Pharma has already found a way to increase their profits on the backs of American taxpayers thanks to loopholes created within the law. Joining me now to talk about this is author, syndicated columnist, and president of Libertas LLC, Cliff Schecter. Cliff, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, Farron. Thanks for having me on, man.
So one of the biggest problems with the Affordable Care Act that came about from the very beginning was that the whole bill was created with the pharmaceutical, the hospital, all these industries had their input in drafting the bill. And as a result of that, the administration is not allowed to negotiate bulk pricing with drug companies. They're not allowed to prevent price gouging by these massive hospital conglomerate corporations that are trying to take over our healthcare industry. And so, tell us about some of the pitfalls that we're seeing so far with the Affordable Care Act.
Well, I don't know. You remember that scene from the movie Airplane where the guy's freaking out and they're slapping him across the face to try to calm him down? And there's a whole line of people behind with like nunchucks and they're getting ready and they've got, that's kind of what happened with the Affordable Care Act in terms of the people that got in the room. We had a line of people like that, as you said, the pharmaceutical industry, the hospitals, the healthcare guys, everybody. We made these deals beforehand, and you pointed out the biggest pitfalls. Let's start. First of all, the biggest pitfall of all is that it's not single payer, which President Obama had a unique ability with a approval rating of about 80% right after he was elected. Republicans had completely discredited an economy that crashed because of Republican ideology, people's willingness to embrace government again.
Well, actually, I was going to say, back to the single-payer issue, the folks on Fox News in particular always like to point out how unpopular the Obamacare is. But when you had the single-payer, the public option in the bill, the thing was overwhelmingly supported by the public. It was only after it was removed that the public was no longer that interested in it. So I'm sorry.
The Republican Party is great at rebranding slogans. What they did is they turned Obamacare itself, Obamacare, into a negative. Like liberal is a negative and gun control is a negative and many other things. When you actually dive beneath that and ask real questions about Obama, do you think that your child should be able to stay on health care till they're 26? Yes, overwhelmingly. Do you think people should not be kicked off of healthcare when they actually need to use their healthcare? Rescission, overwhelmingly yes. Do you think that that people with pre-existing conditions should be able to get affordable health care? Overwhelmingly, yes. And as you point out, the public option, the one part that would have created the competition to make these healthcare companies, we're always talking about competition, and people on the right say it's the best thing. Well, you know what? Competition is a good thing. They just give it lip service. People like you and me, we actually mean it. Had they done that, it allowed the public option, a government entity, to compete with these private entities who waste tons of money on paperwork, spend most of their money on marketing, then the prices would have come down. And so, yes, public option had over 70% support, and you were exactly right. That was like the single payer part of this bill.
Right. Well, and you also had, back in the earliest days when the public was supporting this, they understood that this was going to lower their healthcare costs. The competition was a good thing. This is capitalism. This is what capitalism does.
Right.
But still, now that it's, pieces of it have taken effect, people are looking at it and say, well, I'm not, my prices haven't really changed. I'm still paying as much as 40% out of pocket, I believe is some of the numbers in some areas. But the other part, which is actually a good thing that the public supports, is that if you're not using it, if you're not using that insurance, you can actually get a refund. I remember last summer when those first, Obamacare refunds started hitting the mail,
right.
All of a sudden you saw people say, well, wait a minute. I didn't know I was getting money back. I didn't know insurance companies could do that. And I think that's a great part of it.
I thought they were going to raise my taxes on this. Wrong. I thought it was going to blow a hole in the budget. Wrong. All the other lies that they repeated on the right. Look, what you said about capitalism is right. It's about competition. They're not for capitalism. They claim they're pro-business. What they are is they're pro-crony capitalism. They want their friends, the few guys at the big companies, to get all the benefits, to get all the subsidies and the tax breaks and everything. And this is no different. In the end, it's small business people that get screwed. I have my own business, and my healthcare costs have gone way up. It looks like Obamacare may help bring them down. But the best thing would have been single payer, because the healthcare market has proven to be so corrupted. It's not an actual capitalistic market. People don't know what their choices are. People can't compare plans and say A is better than B. Now, these exchanges are going to help that. So it's not to say that Obamacare hasn't improved things. It has. But the truth is that the capitalist market, the crony capitalism in healthcare, an essential service. It's not like whether you want to buy a banana or yogurt. We all need healthcare. And so to me, it should have been single payer, and it should have been like what the France has the best healthcare in the world, some other countries in Western Europe where you get a basic plan. And if you want to buy something above and beyond that, you can do that if you're wealthy enough to do that. And that would have been a better system. But this system, I'll say quickly, I know I'm talking too much here, Per, but particularly with what they didn't allow, as you said, no public option, no allowing bulk negotiation by HHS and other departments, which is what happens in every other industrialized country. In fact, the Veterans Department's allowed to do that for vets, and guess what? They get much cheaper health care because of it. We didn't allow reimportation, which Obama ran on. The Democrats, as much as Republicans, blocked it. You bring in drugs from Canada and Japan and places like that are perfectly safe, where the drugs go for 40, 50% below ours, you'll get your competition. But all those kinds of cost control measures, they wouldn't allow in the bill.
Right, and I've actually seen reports that say in Canada, because the government is allowed to negotiate bulk pricing with drug companies, they're paying between 2 and 10% markup on these pharmaceuticals, which is not bad when you consider there are lists online where you can see the actual markup. And you do have some drugs, I believe Lipitor is one of them, Celebrex was one, that are marked up 20,000% because it costs 4 cents to make these pills.
You know what we're doing, Farron? We're paying for the marketing for these guys and their R&D for the rest of the world. We're paying for Japan, England, France, a message the Democrats could never figure out, which would be a pretty powerful one, which is, do you like knowing that you're paying for the drugs to be subsidized in Japan and England and France? Because that's what you're doing. We're covering their R&D costs, and we're also covering the huge amount on direct marketing that these guys spend, which didn't even used to be allowed. Only the United States and New Zealand are the only two westernized countries that even allow drugs to be advertised on TV, because it should be your doctor telling you what's best for you, not some people getting together and telling you, hey, I'm happy, you need Cialis. It works.
It's always dangerous when a patient is able to go into a doctor and say, I want this drug because I saw it on TV. That's not a good thing. But let me switch gears a little bit. Okay, we've talked about some of the negatives about this, but there's certainly plenty of positives out there, and it's the Republicans who actually seem to be taking the biggest advantage of these positives. Back in the 2010 midterms when the Tea Party swept Congress, they ran on the platform of, I'm going to repeal Obamacare. This is horrible. This is going to raise your taxes. Elect me. I'm going to get rid of it. And then, so what's happened since then? What have they done?
Well, what's best to know about the Republican Party at this point is hypocrisy isn't something that's an embarrassment or shame like it would be to you and me. It's a value. It's something you brag about. If you're Michelle Bachmann, you attack big government and you take $200,000 in farm subsidies for your farm, right? And just like that, these other guys we're talking about, Jerry Moran, who's the head of the National Republican Senatorial Committee, who will be going around attacking Democrats for being for Obamacare, requested Obamacare funds for hospitals and clinics in Southeast Kansas and wrote letters about how terrific they were. You can go through a whole list of Republicans in my home state here. Senator Rob Portman, Obamacare is terrible, except for in Cleveland, where he needs votes, where he goes and requests funds for the hospitals. We've got those letters. I mean, the best example of all was probably when Joe Biden completely hit Paul Ryan in a debate out of nowhere in 2012 and said, funny, you don't like Obamacare because I've got the letters right here. You sent requesting funds. And of course, Paul Ryan had nothing to say. I mean, again, hypocrisy is a value to these people. They have absolutely no shame, just like on every other issue that we've ever talked about, from their policing people's sexual behavior and then going hiking on the Appalachian Trail to the rest of the things this party does. Believe me, on Obamacare, they're just as hypocritical.
Well, exactly. And it goes back to the whole theme of the party of, you know what, we're against this, but if you're giving out money, let me line up for that. But, the whole Republican mantra of trickle down, Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act, I don't even like to use their word, but it can create real trickle down that actually helps the economy, because these Republicans who go out there and they say, it's horrible, but give me the money, it is going back into the communities. It's building new buildings. It's building mental health facilities. It's building local clinics. That's creating infrastructure. It's creating jobs. It's creating income for these communities that otherwise would not have that. So, trickle down does not work in the sense of if we give rich people money, it's going to come back to us. Trickle down works in the sense of when we have programs like the Affordable Care Act that come out into America and spend money, it raises, everyone. And so I think,
Aaron, rich people aren't going to buy that fifth pair of yacht slippers if you just give them an extra, amount of money. On the other hand, what made this country great through the entire 20th century when we led other countries, we built things. We had the Highway Act under Eisenhower, which created economic development. Productivity went up. People got places quicker. They got to places where they could reach natural resources. The rails, in the middle of the 19th century, and steam. But when we built the infrastructure that we built, we always benefited from it. Always.
Right.
So, to think, and people get jobs, and it ends up being great for the economy. So it's crazy not to do that.
Right, especially when we're at a time in this country now, we need jobs and we need health care. For anyone to come out and say that the Affordable Care Act is an abomination, that it's terrible, that it's going to raise all our taxes, we have to understand that it's going, there are things of it like we discussed earlier. They're not perfect. There are things that could have and should have been done better. And hopefully as time goes on, people are going to come along and they're going to make changes to this. But right now, at a time in this country where 20% of the entire country is having trouble paying their medical bills, and those are the people who can go to the doctor, because we have plenty who still cannot. And so we need this Affordable Care Act to come into cities and states, even if it is a hypocritical Republican, to build these clinics so that people can come, they can get the care, they can keep the health care they have if they develop cancer or if they lose their job. This is a real trickle-down program that is actually working for America, right?
It is. And if the Republicans believed in anything they said they believed in, once again, they would understand it. If they believe that we want to put money in the economy, if people are wasting money in all sorts of healthcare services they can't spend on other things they should be spending on. If people are getting sick because they don't have preventative health care and we're treating them in the hospital, guess what? Guess who's paying for that? Our tax dollars are paying for that. It doesn't make sense that what they say they're for and what they're actually for.
We pay for it anyway, so we might as well put it to good use.
Yeah, we might as well pay for it ahead of time and pay a lot less and then have money to put into other things, like making sure bridges don't collapse in Washington State.
Exactly. Cliff Schecter, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks a lot, Farron. I appreciate it, buddy.
Cliff Schecter is the best-selling author of the book The Real McCain and the president of Libertas LLC consulting firm. And coming up, we're going to be taking a look at why schools across the country are finally opening up to the idea of teaching children about climate change. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Farron Cousins in for Mike Papantonio this week. While some school systems across the country are cutting back on teaching students vital information like evolution and critical thinking, some have actually decided that teaching kids the truth was no longer optional, and climate change has become a part of the curriculum. Joining me now to discuss the push for climate change education is Brendan DeMelle, the Executive Director and Managing Editor of DeSmogBlog.com. Brendan, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Farron.
Hey, so, this past week, big news came out of Kansas, of all places, that the school board there has finally decided that they're going to teach kids grades K through 12 about climate change. Tell us a little about that.
It's a very exciting development, and for once we don't have to ask what's the matter with Kansas. Of all places, we see actual, acceptance of scientific fact and the idea that it needs to be taught to the children of Kansas. And it's a really important issue all across our country because we're falling behind, as we know, in science and math education in particular. And there's really no reason for most states to ignore that fact when they're looking at their curriculum. And it's really critical for science and math to be at the forefront of our educational priority list. So it's refreshing for once to see that climate science in particular gets lifted up as an example of an important thing for every student to learn in school.
Right, and part of the argument against teaching it that was going on in Kansas by none other than the Heartland Institute, and we'll get to them in a minute, but part of the argument was that, this is scientific hooey, we don't know the whole truth, you can't necessarily trust it, and the best one is that we need to teach both sides of the issue. But on things like climate change, there are no two sides, are there?
That's right. I mean, there really aren't. And despite the best efforts of ExxonMobil and other corporations who have tried to jam their own version of the science into classrooms by giving away free materials, coloring books, all kinds of zany ideas, from friendly Frackosaurus cartoon books and things to the more serious efforts by Exxon to infiltrate the National Science Teachers Association to push anti-science into schools. So it's actually a really good development to see that these K through 12 students will be receiving a fair shake. The actual science will be taught. And I really think that as we see this, we see the defeat of some of those anti-science efforts, the voice of reason coming through. It's a refreshing, break from the usual norms of anti-science in the political world that we see. At least in the classroom, these kids will be getting the truth.
Right, and as we pointed out, the Heartland Institute over in Kansas was trying to really hard to prevent this from happening. They did not want kids to learn that climate change is caused from increased emissions. So, and I know you have a history with the Heartland Institute, a DeSmogBlog as well. So tell us a little about what Heartland has done over the years.
Heartland Institute is the classic sort of example of misinformation dressed up as an institute. They attempt to appear as these experts in various fields from climate science to education, and in particular their efforts to defend the tobacco companies early on and to defend the chemical industry from any liability for their products. This is a group that will do anything for $1. They will defend any product no matter how deadly, whether it's cigarettes or asbestos. And this is one of the groups that's up in arms over the fact that climate science will be taught in schools. Well, this is the same group last year, as you mentioned, that DeSmogBlog and others worked to expose for their efforts to get into classrooms. It was in their secret documents that we published. Their effort to infiltrate classrooms was a big priority for them. And obviously they're in a tantrum over this move in Kansas that goes in exactly the opposite direction from where they want to see things. And, I can only imagine whether they'll be putting up billboards of the Unabomber and comparing some climate science teachers to the Unabomber. So we'll see.
Right. And again, there is no real scientific doubt about this issue. I think of all the studies on climate change that have been published, what's the number? Maybe 1%, less than 1% have said that there's question about it?
Yeah, it's very overwhelming. I mean, 98% of climate science in peer-reviewed publications agrees that there's absolutely no doubt that man-made activities are driving climate change, and we see it every day with the extreme weather and the impacts on American communities. Whether it's the hurricanes and rising sea levels displacing people, it's going to be something that no matter what, students and children around the country are going to understand first, through their life experiences. So it's important that we teach, appropriately.
Well, Brendan, thank you very much for staying on this issue, and thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Farron.
By most reports, things in Wisconsin are headed south thanks to Republican Governor Scott Walker. Everything from job creation to voting rights has taken a severe nosedive. And now it looks like the state of North Carolina wants to follow in Wisconsin's footsteps. I have author and Nation magazine contributor Ari Berman with me now to tell us why North Carolina is the new Wisconsin. Ari, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Farron.
So, Ari, okay, before we get to North Carolina, this past week news came out that Wisconsin has fallen to 49th in the Federal Reserve Bank's economic outlook. So things in Wisconsin have gotten obviously pretty bad under Scott Walker. Tell us a little about what's happened so far.
Well, I mean, what's happened in general in Wisconsin is that you had a very progressively run state under both Democrats and Republicans with a long line of good governance become basically run off a Koch brothers model. And so that meant cutting taxes for the very rich in a time of recession. It meant dismantling public sector unions when people really needed those jobs. It meant restricting rights for workers, for voters, for women, and it has turned that state in a very divisive direction, and Wisconsin has reaped very few rewards as a result of it, the kind of trickle-down economics that has been pursued by Scott Walker, not investing in jobs, not investing in education, but really only investing in the richest people in the state, has really hurt the state both politically and economically. And now, unfortunately, we're sort of seeing the Wisconsin model be exported to other states as well.
Right, and in a recent article with The Nation, you talk about that this is now coming, this ALEC model of legislation where we push state governments further and further to the right, even as new reports are showing us that voting bases, state by state, especially in the South, are actually becoming more progressive. And yet still ALEC, the Koch brothers, and these right-wing conservative Tea Party groups are still gaining more power, thanks in part to gerrymandering. So tell us a little bit about this ALEC model legislation that has now come to North Carolina.
Well, what happened in North Carolina is in 2010, you had a guy by the name of Art Pope, who is kind of like the third Koch brother in terms of the amount of money that he gives to Republican politics in North Carolina. You had him, and then you also had national groups in Washington spend a lot of money on state legislative races. Obviously, 2010 was a bad year for Democrats across the board. Doesn't cost that much money to buy a state legislature. So what happened is Pope and some of these national groups in Washington spent a lot of money on state legislative races, were able to take back the North Carolina legislature for Republicans for the first time since the McKinley administration. And then in 2012, Republicans elected Governor Pat McCrory at a time when the Democratic Party in North Carolina was very weak. And so what you have now is you have Republicans in control of North Carolina for the first time in 100 years. And they're just introducing a slew of ALEC approved policies, everything from cutting taxes for the richest North Carolinians while raising taxes for basically everyone else and 95% of other people who live in the state, cutting Medicaid, cutting public education, allowing guns in parks and by schools,
Without background checks too, right?
Without background checks, doing all sorts of things to try to restrict voting rights, really the most brazen restrictions of voting rights that we've seen in any southern state or any state across the country. And what's happening is, this is so important because they're taking what had been the most kind of moderate, progressive, racially integrated swing state, and they're really turning into this deep red place that North Carolina has never been. And I think that has outcomes for the rest of the South, because if North Carolina moves this far right, then what's going to happen to all the other southern states that really look to North Carolina as a check on the conservatism of the South?
Right. So basically, like you said, Republicans finally come into the power for the first time since McKinley. And so one of the first things they do is say, how do we hold on to this power? Yeah. How do we keep this, vitally important state? And so obviously, again, with the Scott Walker model, with the Rick Scott model, they want to restrict voting rights basically for minorities, African Americans, Latinos, college students, making it harder to vote. And we had expected a ruling from the Supreme Court on Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which is vital. Is North Carolina subject to Section 5 restrictions where they have to get their new voting procedures approved?
Yeah, so 40 of 100 counties in North Carolina with a history of voting discrimination dating back to the 1960s are subject to Section 5, meaning they have to get their changes pre-cleared with the federal government. That basically means that there's so many counties that are covered that any voting change with regards to North Carolina really needs to be cleared with the federal government. And what you're seeing is North Carolina Republicans are already acting as if Section 5 has been struck down, because they've introduced legislation that is clearly unconstitutional. You have, for example, the fact that they have a strict voter ID law in which it costs money to actually get the ID, which the Supreme Court has said isn't constitutional.
It's a poll tax. It's a poll tax,
basically. Exactly. And they say, well, there's going to be exemption for the poorest North Carolinians, but really who falls into that category? You have to sign an affidavit saying that you can't afford the ID. Well, what if it later turns out that someone believes you can afford the ID? Are you going to be subject to felony prosecution? They're doing other stuff like eliminating the deduction that parents can take for their kids if they vote on their college campus, which is just absolutely crazy. So let's say you're from Greensboro, but you go to school in Durham and you decide to vote at Duke. Well, are your parents going to lose $2,500 tax credit if you just vote on your college campus? I mean, that's a $2,500 poll tax in many ways. So there's a lot of stuff they've done that is just really, really egregious, that has gone beyond what other states have considered. And I think it's clearly obvious that if they had to submit these changes to the Justice Department or to a federal court in Washington, they would not be cleared.
Well, let's hope that the civil rights group take up this case and prevent North Carolina from becoming the next Wisconsin. Ari Berman, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Ari Berman is the author of the book Herding Donkeys. And that's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com, on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio, and on Facebook. For Mike Papantonio, I'm Farron Cousins, and we'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.